Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that has followed humanity for as long as we've looked up at the sky. A question about aliens, about intelligence far beyond our own, and about whether the reality you experience each day is truly what it seems. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. There are moments, often late at night, when the world grows quiet enough for certain thoughts to surface. Not loud thoughts, not urgent ones, but slow, curious questions that seem to arrive without warning. You might be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, or listening to the faint rhythm of distant traffic. And somewhere in that stillness, a simple idea appears. What if we are not alone? Not in the dramatic sense you might see in movies, not flashing lights or sudden encounters, but something quieter, something far more subtle. What if intelligence exists elsewhere in the universe, in forms so different, so advanced, that we wouldn't even recognize it if it were right in front of us? It's an unsettling thought at first, but also strangely calming, because when you begin to consider the scale of the universe, not in numbers or equations, but in feeling, it becomes harder to believe that we are the only ones asking questions. The night sky, even when it looks empty, is not truly empty. Every point of light is a distant sun, and around many of those suns, there may be worlds, some cold and silent, others warm, perhaps even alive. And among those countless worlds, it's not unreasonable to imagine that somewhere, something has had more time than we have, more time to evolve, to think, to explore. If life began on Earth billions of years ago, and if similar conditions exist elsewhere, then somewhere in the vastness of space, life may have started earlier, much earlier. And even a small difference in time, when stretched across millions or billions of years, can lead to something extraordinary. Think of how much human civilization has changed in just the past few hundred years. From simple tools to machines, from handwritten letters to signals travelling invisibly through the air. Now imagine that same kind of progress, continuing not for hundreds of years but for millions, or even longer. At that point, the difference between us and them would not feel like a gap. It would feel like an entirely different level of existence. Like the difference between a human and a small animal quietly moving through the forest. The animal is alive, it experiences the world, it senses danger, searches for food, and navigates its environment. But it does not understand cities, or science, or the idea of a universe expanding over time, not because it is broken, not because it is missing something important, but because it simply exists at a different level of understanding. And this leads to a quieter, deeper question. If such differences can exist between creatures on the same planet, what kinds of differences might exist between us and something that evolved somewhere else, under entirely different conditions? Something that has had far more time and far more opportunity us to learn. It becomes possible in a very calm and almost gentle way to imagine that intelligence in the universe might not just be greater than ours, but so different that we cannot fully grasp it. And if that is true, then something even more curious begins to unfold. Perhaps the question is not, where are they? but rather, are we capable of noticing them at all? Because noticing something requires more than just eyes. It requires a mind that knows what to look for, a way of interpreting what is seen. And the human mind, remarkable as it is, does not experience the universe directly. It translates it. Every sight, every sound, every sensation you feel is not the universe itself, but a version of it. A carefully constructed interpretation, shaped by your senses and assembled by your brain. The colours you see are not truly out there in the world. They're your mind's way of making sense of different kinds of light. The sounds you hear are not the air itself, but vibrations translated into something meaningful. In a way, you are always living inside a kind of internal model, a representation of reality rather than reality in its raw form. And this model is incredibly useful. It helps you move, survive, and understand the world around you. But it is also limited. It shows you just enough to navigate your environment and quietly filters out everything else, which means that most of what exists never reaches your awareness at all. And this is where the thought becomes both humbling and strangely peaceful. If your perception is only a small window, then the universe beyond that window may be far richer, far more complex, and far more populated than you could ever directly experience. Not because it is hiding, but because it exists outside the narrow band of what your senses can detect and what your mind can interpret. So as you lie there, listening to the soft rhythm of your surroundings, it becomes possible to consider a gentle shift in perspective. Perhaps the universe is not empty. Perhaps it is simply quiet in a way we do not yet understand. And perhaps somewhere beyond the edges of our perception, something is already there, not watching in a dramatic sense, not interfering or guiding, but existing in a way that feels as natural to it as your world feels to you, a presence that does not need to be seen to be real. And as this thought settles softly into place, not as something urgent, but as something to quietly hold, it opens the door to a deeper exploration. Because before we can understand what might exist beyond us, we must first understand how we have tried to make sense of the unknown. How, throughout history, humans have faced the vastness of reality and gently filled its silence with stories, ideas, and explanations that felt just within reach. And as we begin to trace that path, something familiar starts to emerge, like the soft outline of a pattern we've followed for thousands of years, often without even realizing it. As that quiet question lingers, not pressing for an answer, but simply resting there, something else begins to come into focus. Not out there in the stars, but closer, much closer, right here, in the way you experience the world itself. Because before we wonder whether something intelligent might exist beyond us, it helps to pause and ask a simpler question. What exactly are you seeing right now? If you look around, everything feels clear and immediate. The shapes of objects, the colours, the sense of space around you. It all seems direct, as though your eyes are simply opening a window onto reality. But what if it's not quite a window? What if it's more like a translation? Imagine for a moment that you're listening to music through a pair of headphones. The sound feels rich and complete. You hear the melody, the rhythm, the subtle shifts in tone. It feels like you're experiencing the music itself. But in truth, what reaches your ears is not the original performance. It is a version of it, encoded, transmitted, and then reconstructed by the device you're using. Something similar is happening with your senses. Light from the world enters your eyes, but what your brain presents to you is not the light itself. It is a carefully assembled interpretation, a kind of internal picture built from signals and patterns. The colours you see, soft blues, warm yellows, deep reds do not exist out there in quite the way they appear to you. They are the brain's way of organising different kinds of light into something meaningful, in the same way sound is not truly heard as it exists in the air. Vibrations move through space, but what you experience is your mind's translation of those movements into tone and texture. Even the sense of touch, the feeling of pressure or warmth, is not the object itself, but your brain's interpretation of signals coming from your body. It's as though your mind is quietly constructing a version of reality for you to live inside, and it does this incredibly well. So well, in fact, that it's easy to forget that what you're experiencing is not the raw universe, but a filtered, simplified model of it. A model designed not to show everything, but to show just enough for you to move through the world, to recognize patterns, to stay safe, and to make sense of your surroundings. But in order to do that, it must leave things out. A great many things. For example, the light you can see is only a very small part of what actually exists. Beyond the colours visible to your eyes, there are countless other forms of light, some carrying more energy, some less, that pass through the world unnoticed by human senses. They are there, moving all around you, but they never appear in your experience, not because they are hidden, but because your mind was never designed to include them. In the same way, there are sounds too low or too high for your ears to detect, movements too small to notice, patterns too complex to immediately understand. And yet, all of these things are still part of the same universe you inhabit. It begins to feel less like you are seeing the world, and more like you're seeing a carefully selected version of it, a version shaped by what your mind can process. And this brings us to a quiet realization. If your experience of reality is already a kind of interpretation, then what you call the world is not the full story. It is a useful story, a consistent one, but not a complete one. Which means that anything existing outside of that story, anything that does not fit within the limits of your perception, might simply never appear to you at all, not as something hidden in the shadows, but as something that never enters the picture in the first place. This idea can feel a little unsettling at first, but if you sit with it for a moment, it also carries a certain kind of calm, because it suggests that the unknown is not necessarily distant or unreachable. It may simply be unrecognized, like a quiet layer beneath everything you already see. To make this a little more familiar, you might think of it like using a map on your phone. The map shows you roads, buildings, and directions. It gives you exactly what you need to navigate from one place to another, but it does not show you everything. It does not show the texture of the ground, the movement of the wind, or the countless small details that make up the full environment. It simplifies reality into something manageable, and in doing so, it becomes useful. Your mind does something very similar. It creates a map of reality, not the territory itself. And that map is shaped by your biology, your senses, and the limits of your brain's processing. Now imagine something that does not rely on the same kind of map. Something that perceives the universe in a way completely different from you. It might notice patterns you cannot see. It might move through layers of reality you're not even aware exist. And from its perspective, your version of the world might appear just as limited as the map on your phone appears when compared to the full landscape. This is where the earlier question begins to return, but in a quieter, more thoughtful way. If something like that exists, would you even know? Or would it be like trying to explain colours to someone who has never seen them, or music to someone who has never heard sound? The challenge is not just distance, it is not just technology, it is the structure of perception itself, the very way in which experience is built. And so, when we look up at the night sky and ask whether we are alone. We are not just asking about what is out there, we are also asking about the limits of what we are capable of noticing. And as this idea begins to settle, not as a conclusion, but as a gentle shift in perspective, it invites us to look back through history, to see how humans have always responded to the unknown, how, when faced with things they could not yet understand, they found ways to fill in the gaps, not out of ignorance, but out of a very natural desire to make sense of the world. And in that long, quiet history of wondering, something familiar begins to emerge, a pattern that has repeated itself again and again, each time the edges of a knowledge stretch just a little further into the dark. As that quiet awareness settles in, that what you experience is not the full universe, but a carefully shaped version of it, it becomes easier to understand something about human history that often goes unnoticed. For most of our existence, we have lived surrounded by things we did not understand. The sky above us shifting from bright blue to deep black, the sudden flash of lightning, the distant rumble of thunder, the changing seasons, the mystery of life, and the even deeper mystery of death. These were not small questions. They were immediate, powerful, and sometimes frightening experiences, and so naturally humans began to ask why. Not in the careful, measured way that science does today, but in a way that felt intuitive, personal, familiar. If something happened, there must be a reason. And if there is a reason, perhaps there is something behind it, something with intention. In ancient times, storms were not just patterns in the atmosphere. They were expressions of something greater, a force with emotion, with purpose. The crashing of thunder might be seen as a voice, lightning as a gesture. The ocean, vast and unpredictable, was not just water. It became something alive, something that could be calm one day and violent the next. These ideas may seem distant now, almost poetic, but they served a very real purpose. They gave structure to the unknown. They allowed people to live in a world that felt understandable, even when the true mechanisms behind events remained hidden. If the crops failed, there was a reason. If the rains came, there was a cause. Even if that cause was not something that could be measured or tested, it was something that could be imagined. An imagination, in those moments, was not a weakness. It was a way of coping with uncertainty, a way of bringing the vastness of reality into a form that the human mind could hold. You might think of it like telling a story in the dark. When the details are unclear, the mind begins to fill in the shapes. It connects patterns. It creates meaning, even where there is none yet understood. Over time, these stories became traditions, and those traditions became beliefs, not because people were careless or unwilling to seek truth, but because they were working with the tools they had. They were doing the best they could with the limits of perception and knowledge that were available to them. And in many ways, that instinct to explain, to understand, to reduce uncertainty has never left us. It has simply changed form. There is a quiet idea often discussed in modern science and philosophy, sometimes called the God of the Gaps. It describes a pattern that has appeared again and again throughout history. Whenever there is something we do not yet understand, we place an explanation into that space. At first, those explanations were often supernatural, but as knowledge grew, those gaps began to shrink. We learned that lightning is not a voice, but a natural process, that the movement of the stars follows patterns that can be described and predicted, that the ocean's tides are not guided by intention, but by the gentle pull of a distant companion in the sky. And with each discovery, one gap closed and another opened. Because every answer leads to a new question. Every explanation reveals something deeper still waiting to be understood. But something interesting has happened along the way. The shape of the explanation has changed, but the pattern has not, where once the unknown was filled with gods, today it is sometimes filled with other ideas, aliens for example. When something unusual appears, something we cannot easily explain, it can be tempting to imagine that it comes from somewhere beyond us, from a distant intelligence, a hidden observer, a presence just out of reach. And while the possibility of life beyond Earth is a serious scientific question, this instinct to place something into the unknown remains very human. It is not a flaw, it is a reflection of how the mind works. We are meaning-making creatures. We are not comfortable with empty spaces in our understanding, so we fill them, gently, naturally, often without even noticing. But as we begin to explore the universe more carefully, something subtle begins to shift. We start to see that the unknown is not something to be immediately filled. It is something to be approached, slowly, carefully. Because the more we learn, the more we realize that reality is not always what it first appears to be, and the explanations that feel most natural are not always the ones that are correct. This does not make the earlier stories meaningless. In fact, they reveal something important about us. They show that even in the absence of knowledge, humans have always been searching, always reaching toward understanding, even if the path was not yet clear. And that search, that quiet curiosity, is what eventually gave rise to something new, a different way of asking questions, a different way of exploring the unknown, one that does not begin with an answer, but with a test, one that does not rely on imagination alone, but on observation, repetition, and careful refinement. A way of thinking that would slowly reshape our understanding of the universe, not all at once, not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow light of dawn replacing the darkness of night. And as this shift begins to take form, it leads us toward a quieter, more precise way of exploring reality, a way that does not promise certainty, but offers something perhaps more valuable, a method for getting closer to the truth, one small step at a time. As that long history of storytelling fades gently into the background, something new begins to take its place, not all at once, not as a sudden shift, but slowly, almost quietly. A different way of asking questions begins to emerge. Instead of asking, "Who caused this?" people begin to ask, "How does this work?" It may seem like a small difference, just a change in wording. But it changes everything, because once you begin to ask how something works, you're no longer satisfied with the story alone. You begin to look for patterns. You begin to test ideas. You begin to notice whether something happens the same way, again and again. And from that careful observation, something remarkable begins to grow. A method, a way of exploring reality that does not depend on tradition or authority or imagination alone, but on something much more grounded, on evidence. You might imagine a person long ago watching lightning strike from the sky. For generations, it may have been seen as a sign of something intentional, something emotional, perhaps even personal. But then, someone begins to notice patterns. That lightning tends to appear during certain conditions, that it follows a path, that it interacts with objects in consistent ways, and slowly, piece by piece, the mystery begins to take on a different shape. Not something driven by intention, but something governed by natural processes. Later, with the development of simple experiments, people discover that electricity can be generated, stored, and guided. And eventually, something that once inspired fear becomes something that can be understood and even used. A similar transformation happens with the movement of the stars. For a long time, their paths across the sky were seen as fixed, almost perfect. But careful observation revealed small irregularities, subtle shifts that didn't quite match the expected patterns. Rather than ignoring these differences, early thinkers began to study them, to measure, to record, and to compare. And over time, a deeper understanding emerged. Not perfect circles, but more complex paths. Not fixed positions, but systems in motion. The sky, once seen as unchanging, was revealed to be dynamic. And this is one of the quiet strengths of science. It does not require perfection at the beginning. It allows for mistakes. In fact, it expects them. An idea can be proposed, tested, refined, and sometimes replaced entirely. This might feel uncertain at first, but there is something deeply reassuring about it, because it means that knowledge is not fixed. It grows, it adjusts, it becomes more accurate over time, not by holding on to certainty, but by being willing to let it go. There is a gentle distinction here that is worth noticing. In everyday language, the word "a theory" often means a guess, something uncertain, but in science, a theory is something quite different. It is not the beginning of understanding, but the result of it. It is an idea that has been tested again and again across many situations, one that continues to hold up under careful observation. Before that stage, there is something simpler, a hypothesis, a starting point, a possible explanation that can be explored. A hypothesis asks a question in a structured way. It suggests what might happen under certain conditions, and then it is tested. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, that is not a failure. It is information, a step closer to understanding what is actually happening. Over time, as more evidence gathers, as patterns become clearer, a hypothesis may grow into something more stable, something that can be relied upon, not because it feels right, but because it has been observed to work, and even then it remains open, always ready to be refined or expanded or adjusted if new information appears. This is where science becomes something quietly powerful. It does not claim to know everything. In fact, it is most confident in the areas where it has been tested the most, and most careful in the areas where questions remain. You might think of it like walking through a landscape at night with a small light. The light shows you a clear path in front of you. You can see where you are stepping. You can move forward safely. But beyond that small circle of light, there is still darkness. And as you walk forward, that circle of light moves with you, revealing new ground, while also showing you just how much remains unseen. In this way, knowledge and mystery grow together. The more we understand, the more we become aware of what we do not yet understand. And this is not a limitation. It is a kind of balance, a quiet reminder that reality is always larger than our current picture of it. So when science replaces earlier explanations, it does not eliminate wonder, it reshapes it. It transforms mystery from something to be filled with immediate answers into something to be explored, patiently and carefully. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how we respond to the unknown. Instead of rushing to explain it, we learn to sit with it, to observe, to ask better questions, and to accept that sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we don't know yet. And as this way of thinking settles in, not as something rigid, but as something quietly steady, it opens the door to a deeper realization. Because if knowledge grows by expanding into the unknown, then the unknown itself is not shrinking. It is growing too, not in size, but in clarity. Like a horizon that moves further away the closer you get. And as we begin to follow that moving horizon, something surprising begins to appear. The realization that the more we learn about the universe, the more mysterious it becomes. Time equals, quote, 3 seconds, quote, / greater than. As that image of walking with a small light settles gently in your mind, something about it begins to feel familiar, not just as a metaphor, but as a way of understanding how humans move through knowledge itself. Because at every point in history we have stood within that small circle of light, feeling for a moment as though we could see clearly, and for a moment we could. Within that illuminated space, patterns make sense, predictions work, the world feels understandable, but just beyond it, the unknown waits, not as something threatening, not as something hiding, but simply as something not yet explored. And what is quietly remarkable about science is not that it eliminates that darkness, but that it teaches us how to walk forward without needing to pretend the darkness isn't there. There is a natural temptation when we learn something new to feel a sense of certainty, to believe that we have finally arrived at an answer, and in small ways that is true. When you understand why the sky changes colour at sunset, or how electricity flows, or how planets move, those pieces of knowledge become stable, reliable. But science carries within it a quiet discipline, a reminder that even our most confident understandings are still part of a larger picture, one that may continue to evolve. There was a time when the motion of objects seemed completely understood. Things fell, things moved, patterns were observed and described with great precision, and for a long while it felt complete. But then, as measurements became more careful, as observations extended into new conditions, small inconsistencies began to appear, not large enough to break the system entirely, but enough to suggest that something deeper was at play. And instead of ignoring those inconsistencies, science followed them. It leaned into the uncertainty, and in doing so, it discovered that the earlier understanding was not wrong, but incomplete. It worked well within certain conditions, but needed to be expanded to account for a wider view of reality. This pattern repeats again and again. An idea forms, it explains what we observe, it becomes trusted, and then, at the edges, something new appears, a detail that doesn't quite fit, a result that cannot be fully explained, and instead of forcing that detail into the existing framework, science allows the framework itself to change, gently, gradually. In this way, knowledge becomes something alive, not fixed but evolving, not fragile but adaptable, and perhaps most importantly, not driven by the need to be right, but by the desire to be accurate. There is a quiet humility in that, a willingness to say, this is what we understand so far, and we are open to learning more. And this humility becomes especially visible at the edges of knowledge, in the places where questions remain unanswered. In those regions, science does not become louder, it becomes quieter, more careful, more attentive, because it recognizes that the unknown is not a failure of understanding, but an invitation to look more closely, to ask better questions, to refine the tools we use to explore the universe. And as this process continues, something subtle begins to emerge, a pattern that is not immediately obvious, but becomes clearer over time. As our knowledge grows, so does our awareness of what we do not know. It is not that the unknown is increasing in size, but that its boundaries are becoming more visible. You might imagine a circle drawn on a vast surface. Inside the circle is everything you currently understand. Outside it, everything you do not. As the circle expands, the boundary between known and unknown grows larger as well, not smaller, which means that every step forward, every discovery, every new insight brings with it a greater sense of how much remains unexplored. This idea can feel surprising at first. You might expect that learning more would reduce uncertainty, and in some ways it does, but it also reveals new layers of complexity, new questions that were not even visible before. It's like walking into a room and turning on the light. At first, you see what's directly around you, but as your eyes adjust, you begin to notice details you hadn't seen at first. Corners, textures, subtle movements. The more clearly you see, the more there is to notice, and this is one of the most beautiful aspects of science. It does not promise a final answer. It does not offer a complete map of reality. Instead, it offers a path, a way of moving forward, step by step, with curiosity and care. And along that path, it teaches us something that goes beyond facts or formulas. It teaches us how to live with uncertainty, not as something uncomfortable, but as something natural, a quiet companion to understanding. So when we ask the largest questions about the universe, about life, about whether something greater might exist beyond us, science does not rush to fill the silence with immediate answers. It allows the silence to remain, and in that silence, it listens, carefully, patiently, waiting for patterns to emerge. And as we begin to follow that approach, as we allow knowledge and mystery to grow together, something deeper begins to take shape. Because at the far edges of what we understand, we begin to encounter questions that feel different, not just difficult, but fundamentally challenging. Questions that ask not only what the universe is, but whether we, as human beings, are capable of fully understanding it at all. As that quiet sense of humility settles in, the understanding that knowledge grows, but never quite reaches the edge, our attention begins to drift outward, away from human history, away from the way we think, and toward the universe itself. Because if there is one place where this balance between knowledge and mystery becomes most visible, it is in the vastness beyond our world. When you look up at the night sky, it can feel calm, still, almost simple, a scattering of lights across a dark background. But that simplicity is an illusion of distance. Each point of light you see is not small, it is not close, it is not quiet in the way it appears. Each one is a distant sun, many of them far larger than the one that warms your days, many surrounded by worlds of their own. And those lights are only a tiny fraction of what is actually there. Because beyond what your eyes can detect, there are countless other stars, galaxies, and structures stretching across distances so vast that even light, the fastest thing we know, takes years, centuries, or far longer to travel between them. If you could step back far enough to see the universe as a whole, it would not look like scattered points of light. It would resemble something more like a vast, intricate web. Galaxies gathered into clusters, clusters connected by long, faint strands, enormous regions of space where almost nothing exists, followed by regions where matter is densely woven together, a structure so large that it is difficult to fully imagine. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because even as we map this immense cosmic structure, something unexpected appears. When scientists measure how galaxies move, how they rotate, how they cluster, they notice something unusual. The visible matter, the stars, the gas, the dust, does not seem to be enough to explain what is happening. It is as though there is more there than we can see. More mass, more presence, something that does not emit light, does not reflect it, and does not interact with our senses in any direct way. And yet, it shapes the motion of galaxies. It holds them together. This unseen component has come to be known as dark matter. not because it is literally dark in the way we experience darkness, but because it does not reveal itself through light. We do not see it directly, we infer it, like noticing the wind not by seeing it, but by watching the movement of leaves. In the same way, we observe how galaxies behave, and from that behaviour, we sense the presence of something invisible, and dark matter is only part of the story. When we look at the universe on even larger scales, something else begins to emerge. The universe is expanding. This idea alone is already remarkable. Space itself is stretching. Galaxies are drifting apart not because they are moving through space in the usual sense, but because the space between them is growing, and more surprisingly, this expansion is not slowing down, it is accelerating, as though something is gently pushing everything apart, something subtle, persistent, something we cannot directly observe. This effect has been given a name: dark energy. Again, not because we fully understand what it is, but because we can observe its influence. Together, these two components, dark matter and dark energy, make up the vast majority of the universe, not a small portion, not a hidden corner, but nearly everything. What we can directly see, the stars, the planets, the galaxies, represents only a small fraction of the total, a thin layer of visibility, floating within a much larger unseen structure. You might imagine it like looking at the surface of the ocean. Waves rise and fall, light reflects, movement is visible. But beneath that surface, the majority of the ocean exists in silence, depths that are rarely seen, and even more rarely understood. In a similar way, the universe we observe is like the surface, and most of what exists lies beneath, not hidden in a deliberate way, but simply beyond the reach of our current understanding. This realization can feel both vast and quiet at the same time, because it means that even at the larger scales, even with all the tools we've developed, all the observations we have made, we are still only beginning to understand the structure of reality. We can describe how galaxies move, we can measure distances, we can trace patterns across billions of years. But when it comes to the deeper question, what the universe is actually made of in its entirety, the answer remains incomplete. And this is not a failure. It's a reflection of how far we have come and how much further there is to go. Because each discovery, rather than closing the story, opens it wider. Dark matter tells us that what we see is not all that exists. Dark energy tells us that even the large-scale behavior of the universe is influenced by something we do not yet fully understand. And together, they form a quiet reminder that the visible universe, the part we can observe, measure, and describe, is only a small window into something far greater. And as this idea begins to settle, it gently shifts the way we think about our place within it. Because if most of the universe is made of something we cannot directly perceive, then the possibility that other forms of existence might also lie beyond our awareness no longer feels so distant. Not something extraordinary, but something consistent with the pattern we are already beginning to see. A universe where the unseen is not the exception, but the rule. And as we continue to explore this vast, partially hidden reality, our attention begins to turn toward the questions that naturally arise from it. Questions that do not just describe what we observe, but reach toward what we do not yet understand. Questions that have remained quietly persistent, even as our knowledge has grown. The kinds of questions that scientists return to again and again, not because they expect easy answers, but because they reveal just how deep the mystery truly goes. As that image of the universe begins to settle, vast, layered, and mostly unseen, something naturally follows. a shift from observing what we know to noticing what we do not, because once you begin to see how much of reality remains beyond our understanding, certain questions begin to stand out. Not loud questions, not urgent ones, but persistent, the kind that return again and again, often in moments of stillness, the kind that do not demand immediate answers, but quietly invite reflection. You might recognize them. Where did everything come from? Not just in the sense of stars or galaxies, but everything, space itself, time itself, the very structure of existence. If you trace the universe backward, following the expansion of space to earlier and earlier moments, you arrive at a time when everything was far closer together, denser, hotter, more concentrated, a state often described as the beginning of the universe. But even here, the question does not end, because once you reach that point, another question emerges. What came before that? It's a simple question in language, but a difficult one in meaning, because before assumes time already exists, and if time itself is part of the universe, then asking what came before it may be like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question feels natural, but it may not apply in the way we expect, and so, rather than a clear answer, we're left with something softer, a boundary, not a wall, but a place where our current understanding begins to fade. Another question drifts in just as quietly. How did life begin? On this planet, life appears as a complex web of processes, cells, structures, patterns that sustain themselves and evolve over time. But if you follow that complexity backward, it becomes simpler, and simpler still, until you arrive at a point where the distinction between living and non-living is no longer clear, where chemistry transitions into biology in ways that are not yet fully understood. We know the building blocks, we understand many of the processes, but the exact path, the moment where matter began to organize itself into something we would call alive, remains uncertain, not because we haven't tried to understand it, but because the steps are subtle, gradual, and spread across vast stretches of time. Then there is the question of consciousness, the simple fact that you are aware right now, that you can observe your thoughts, feel sensations, reflect on ideas. From a scientific perspective, this awareness is connected to the activity of the brain, patterns of signals, interactions between cells, complex networks of activity. And yet, even with all we have learned, there is still something about consciousness that feels difficult to fully describe, not in terms of function, but in terms of experience. Why does it feel like something to be aware? Why is there an inner world at all? It is not that science ignores this question, it is that the answer is still forming. And as we look outward again, another question appears. Are we alone? Given the scale of the universe, the number of stars, the number of worlds, it seems unlikely that life would exist in only one place, and yet so far we have not found clear evidence of intelligent life beyond our own planet. This is sometimes framed as a quiet puzzle, not a contradiction, but a curiosity, because the universe is vast enough to allow for many possibilities, and yet from our current vantage point it remains silent. But perhaps the most subtle question of all is this one. Are we capable of understanding the universe in its entirety? Not just the parts we've explored so far, but everything, all layers, all structures, all aspects of reality. At first, it might seem that with enough time, enough effort, and enough technology, any question could be answered. But as we've already begun to see, our understanding is shaped by the limits of perception and cognition, the way our minds interpret information, the range of what we can detect, the structures we use to think. And it becomes possible in a very calm and thoughtful way to consider that some aspects of reality may always remain just beyond reach, not hidden intentionally, not inaccessible because of distance, but simply because they exist outside the framework of what we are capable of fully grasping. Like a complex idea that cannot be explained in simpler terms, not because it is complicated, but because it requires a way of thinking that has not yet formed. This does not make the universe less meaningful. In many ways, it makes it more so, because it suggests that exploration is not about reaching a final answer, but about continuing the process of understanding, step by step, question by question, each answer revealing something new, each mystery opening into something deeper. And as these questions begin to gather, not as a list but as a quiet presence in the background, they form something like a horizon, a place where knowledge and mystery meet, a place that moves as we move, always just a little further ahead, and it is along this horizon that our curiosity continues to travel, not in a straight line, not toward a final destination, but in a slow, unfolding journey, one that brings us closer to understanding, even as it reminds us how much remains unknown. And as we follow that horizon a little further, something begins to emerge, a realization that the limits we encounter are not just out there in the universe, but within us as well, in the way we perceive, in the way we think, in the very structure of the human mind. As those questions begin to settle, not demanding answers but simply existing, something subtle starts to take shape, a pattern that is easy to miss at first but becomes clearer the longer you sit with it, because each question we ask, no matter how carefully, seems to open into something larger, not smaller, larger. It might feel natural to imagine that knowledge works like filling a container, that with each discovery we add something new, and slowly, steadily the unknown is reduced. But the experience of science suggests something quite different. It is less like filling a container and more like expanding a boundary. Imagine again that circle we spoke of earlier. Inside it, everything you understand. Outside it, everything you do not. At first, the circle is small. There are many things beyond it, but you're not aware of most of them yet. Your attention rests comfortably within what is known. But as the circle grows, something unexpected happens. The boundary between what you know and what you do not know becomes larger, not smaller, because now you're aware of more possibilities, more details, more layers that were invisible before. Each step forward brings clarity, but also reveals complexity. You begin to see not just answers, but the edges of deeper questions. This is not a flaw in understanding. It is a natural consequence of it. When early observers studied the motion of the stars, they saw patterns, predictable movements, repeating cycles. It seemed for a time that the system was simple and complete. But as observations became more precise, small irregularities appeared, movements that did not quite match expectations, and rather than dismissing these details, they became the starting point for deeper investigation, which revealed that the system was not simple, but layered. What appeared smooth from a distance became more intricate up close, and this pattern continues no matter how far we look. At the scale of planets, we find systems. At the scale of stars, we find processes. At the scale of galaxies, we find structures. And at the scale of the universe, we find questions that reach beyond our current understanding. Each layer reveals another beneath it. Each answer carries within it the seed of another question. It is as though reality is not a single surface, but a series of depths. And as we descend gently and carefully, we begin to sense that there may not be a final layer waiting at the bottom, only more depth. This can feel unsettling at first, the idea that there may not be a final complete explanation. But there is also something quietly beautiful about it, because it means that the process of discovery is never exhausted. There is always something more to learn, something more to notice. The universe does not close itself off once it has been understood. It continues to unfold. In a way, this transforms the idea of ignorance. Instead of seeing it as a lack, something to be eliminated, it becomes something else. A frontier, a place where exploration begins, a place that invites curiosity rather than fear. You might think of it like standing at the edge of a vast landscape just before sunrise. At first, everything is dim, shapes are unclear, details are hidden. But as the light slowly grows, more of the landscape becomes visible. And with that visibility comes a realization: the landscape is larger than you thought, not because it's changed, but because you can now see more of it. In the same way, knowledge does not shrink the unknown, it reveals its true scale. And this brings us to a quiet and important shift in perspective. The goal of understanding is not to eliminate mystery, but to engage with it, to move closer step by step without needing to reach the end. Because the end may not be something that exists in the way we expect. And as this idea begins to settle, something else begins to follow, a question that feels both simple and profound. If the unknown continues to expand as we learn, then what does that say about our ability to fully understand reality? Not just now, but ever. Is it possible that the universe is, in some ways, always just beyond the limits of what we can grasp? Not because it is deliberately hidden, but because our way of perceiving and thinking has its own boundaries. Boundaries that shape what we can notice and what we can understand. And if that is true, then the horizon we've been following is not just out there in the universe. It is also within us, in the structure of our senses, in the patterns of our thoughts, in the very way our minds construct meaning. And as we begin to turn our attention inward, not away from the universe, but deeper into how we experience it, we arrive at a quieter realization that the limits we encounter may not only belong to the universe itself, but to the way we are built to understand it. As that quiet horizon of knowledge continues to expand, and with it, the awareness of everything beyond, our attention begins to turn inward once more, not away from the universe, but toward the way we experience it. Because if the unknown continues to stretch outward, always just beyond reach, then it becomes natural to wonder whether part of that distance is not out there at all, but within us, in the way we perceive, in the way we are built to notice certain things, and not others. If you take a slow look around you right now, everything feels complete. The shapes of objects, the colours, the sense of space, it all appears stable and whole. It feels like you are seeing reality as it is, but in a very quiet and important sense. You are not. What you're experiencing is a narrow slice, a carefully filtered version of something much larger. To understand this, it helps to imagine the world not as solid objects and colours, but as something more subtle, a continuous flow of energy, patterns and signals. Light, for example, comes in many forms. Some of it your eyes can detect, and when it reaches you it becomes colour. Soft shades, gentle contrasts, familiar tones. But beyond those colours, there are countless other forms of light moving through the same space. Some carry more energy, some less. Some pass through objects, others are absorbed. They are present all around you, but they never appear in your experience. Not because they are hidden, but because your eyes were never designed to see them. In a similar way, sound exists across a wide range of vibrations. There are deep, slow movements of air, and there are rapid, high-pitched ones. But your hearing captures only a small portion of that range. The rest passes by unnoticed, as though it were never there at all. You might imagine it like sitting in a vast concert hall while only being able to hear a single note, a clear, steady tone. It feels complete, but surrounding it, beyond your awareness, an entire symphony is unfolding, layers of sound, harmonies, rhythms, all existing in the same space. And yet, from your perspective, only that single note exists. This is not a limitation in a negative sense. It is a form of efficiency. Your senses are tuned to detect what is most useful for survival, to recognize patterns, to respond to your environment, to navigate the world around you. They do not aim to capture everything. They aim to capture just enough. And your brain takes that limited input and shapes it into something coherent. It fills in gaps. It stabilizes motion. It creates continuity where there might otherwise be fragmentation. In doing so, it gives you a world that feels solid, continuous, and real. But beneath that constructed experience, the underlying reality may be far more complex than it appears. There is another way to sense this. If you think about how quickly your surroundings can change depending on conditions, light fading at dusk, shadows shifting, colours becoming softer, you begin to notice how much your perception depends on context. The world itself may not have changed in any dramatic way, but your experience of it has. And this suggests something important, that what you perceive is not simply what is there, but what your system is able to interpret at any given moment. Now, gently extend this idea a little further. If your perception is limited to a narrow range, then it is entirely possible that other aspects of reality exist just beyond that range, not distant in space, not hidden behind barriers, but simply outside the boundaries of what your senses can detect. And if something exists outside those boundaries, it would not appear invisible in the way we usually think of invisibility. It would not appear at all. It would leave no direct trace in your experience, not because it is absent, but because it is not part of the channel through which you receive information. This leads to a quiet and somewhat humbling realization that the world you experience, as rich and detailed as it feels, is only a partial view, a kind of interface, a translation layer between something deeper and your awareness of it. And just as different devices can display the same information in different ways, it becomes possible to imagine that different forms of perception might reveal entirely different aspects of reality. A creature with different senses might experience a completely different world, even while existing in the same space as you. Not because the world has changed, but because the way it is being interpreted has, and if that is true, then the idea that something could exist beyond our awareness no longer feels abstract. It becomes a natural extension of how perception already works, a continuation of the pattern we are beginning to see. That reality, in its full form, may be far richer than what we're able to access, and that our experience, as vivid and meaningful as it is, may be only one version among many possible ways of perceiving the same underlying universe. As this idea begins to settle, gently, without urgency, it opens the door to another question. Because if our perception is limited, then our understanding, which is built upon that perception, may also have its limits, and beyond those limits, something else may be waiting, not necessarily hidden, but simply existing at a level we are not yet equipped to fully grasp. Time equals quote 3 seconds quote / greater than, as that quiet realization settles in, that what you perceive is only a narrow slice of a much larger reality. Another layer begins to unfold, because perception is only one part of the story. What you are able to see and hear shapes your experience, but what you are able to understand shapes something even deeper, the way you make sense of the world, the way you build meaning from what you observe. And this is where a different kind of limit begins to appear. not in the senses, but in the mind itself. To explore this, it helps to consider something simple and familiar: the difference between a human and another intelligent creature on Earth. There are animals that are aware, responsive, capable of learning and adapting. They recognize patterns, they remember, they solve problems within their environment, and yet even the most intelligent among them do not build telescopes, write mathematics, or ask questions about the origin of the universe, not because they lack awareness, but because their way of understanding the world operates at a different level. You might imagine sitting beside such a creature, looking up at the night sky together. You see stars, patterns, distances, possibilities. You might think about how long the light has travelled, how those stars may have their own systems, their own histories. But for the animal beside you, the sky is simply part of the environment. It may notice brightness, movement, perhaps changes over time. But the deeper meaning, the layers of interpretation you bring to that same view, are not present. And this difference does not require an enormous gap in biology. In fact, the genetic difference between humans and some other species is surprisingly small. A subtle shift, a slight variation in structure and function, and yet the result is a profound difference in understanding. This suggests something important, that even a small change in cognitive ability can lead to a very large difference in how reality is perceived and interpreted. Now gently extend that idea outward. If a small gap between species on Earth can create such a difference, what might happen if there exists something just slightly beyond human intelligence, not infinitely advanced, not beyond imagination, just a little further along, a mind that can process patterns more deeply, that can recognize structures we cannot see, that can connect ideas in ways that feel natural to it, but invisible to us. From its perspective, our understanding might appear incomplete, simplified, like a rough outline of something far more detailed, and from our perspective, its understanding might not appear as understanding at all. It might seem like noise or randomness or something we cannot even identify as meaningful. This is where the idea becomes quietly profound, because it suggests that intelligence is not just a matter of knowing more, but of seeing differently, of organizing reality in ways that are not accessible from lower levels of understanding. And this creates a kind of boundary, not a physical one, but a conceptual one, a limit beyond which communication becomes difficult, or even impossible. You might think of trying to explain advanced mathematics to a small animal. No matter how patiently you try, the concepts do not translate, not because the animal is unwilling, but because the structures required to hold those ideas are not there. And so, the explanation cannot take root. It passes through without meaning. Now consider the possibility that something like this could exist beyond us, a form of intelligence that is not infinitely distant, but simply different enough, different in the way it processes information, different in the patterns it recognizes, different in the depth at which it understands reality. And if that is the case, then the question of whether such intelligence exists becomes more subtle, because the issue may not be distance, it may not be technology, it may not even be visibility, it may be comprehension, the ability to recognize something as intelligent in the first place. If a signal were present, would we understand it? If a structure existed, would we notice it as meaningful? Or would it appear as background noise, something too complex or too unfamiliar to interpret? This idea gently reshapes the question we began with. Not, where are they? But, what if we're not equipped to understand them? And there is another possibility that follows, equally quiet. What if the gap works both ways? Just as we cannot easily communicate complex ideas to other creatures, A more advanced intelligence might not find it meaningful to communicate with us in ways we could understand, not out of indifference, but because the difference in perspective is too great, like trying to describe the full richness of a landscape using only a single colour. It is not that the landscape is empty, it is that the medium cannot carry the detail, and so the possibility begins to take shape, slowly, gently. That intelligence in the universe may exist across many levels, each one experiencing reality in its own way, each one limited, in some sense, by the structures through which it understands the world. And as we consider this, not as something alarming but as something natural, it leads to a deeper reflection, because if such limits exist, then there may be aspects of reality that are not just unseen, but fundamentally beyond our ability to fully grasp, not because we have not yet learned enough, but because our way of understanding has its own boundaries that shape what can be known, and what may always remain just beyond reach. As that idea settles in, that even small differences in intelligence can create vast distances in our understanding, something deeper begins to emerge. Not a new question exactly, but a shift in how we hold the questions we already have. Because until now, it has been natural to assume that with enough time, enough knowledge, enough progress, we might eventually understand everything. That the universe, no matter how complex, is ultimately something that can be fully explained, fully mapped, fully known. But as we move gently through these layers of thought, another possibility begins to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet consideration. What if there are aspects of reality that are not just difficult to understand, but fundamentally beyond our ability to fully grasp? Not hidden behind distance, not waiting for better tools, but existing outside the structure of how we think. To explore this idea, it helps to return to something simple. Consider the difference between a human mind and that of another creature. There are concepts, numbers, patterns, abstractions that come naturally to you. You can imagine infinity. You can think about time stretching far into the past or future. You can consider ideas that do not exist physically, yet still feel meaningful. But these same ideas cannot be fully communicated to many other forms of life, not because they are too complex in a technical sense, but because they require a way of thinking that is not shared, a structure that is not present. And so, even if you try to explain, the meaning would not arrive. Now gently extend that idea again. If there are forms of understanding beyond ours, then there may also be concepts that we are not equipped to hold, not because they are hidden from us, but because they require a framework that we do not possess. You might imagine trying to see a colour that does not exist within the range of your vision, not a colour you haven't seen yet, but one that your mind has no way of representing. No matter how it is described, no matter how carefully it is explained, it cannot appear in your experience. Not because it is distant, but because it does not fit within the system through which you perceive. In the same way, there may be ideas, structures, or truths about the universe that cannot fully take form within the human mind, not because we have not discovered them yet, but because they do not translate into the patterns we use to think. This is sometimes described in a very quiet and careful way as an information boundary, a limit not of distance, but of comprehension, a place where understanding does not gradually fade, but simply cannot extend. At first, this idea might feel unsettling, the thought that there could be truths we will never fully understand. But if you sit with it for a moment, it begins to soften, because it does not diminish what we do know. It does not make knowledge meaningless. Instead, it places knowledge within a larger context, a recognition that understanding is always part of a bigger landscape. You might think of it like standing at the edge of the ocean. You can see the waves, feel the water, understand the motion near the shore. But beyond that, the ocean extends far deeper than what you can directly experience, and yet the part you can observe is still real, still meaningful, still worth exploring. The depth does not take away from the surface, it adds to it. In the same way, the possibility that some aspects of reality lie beyond our understanding does not reduce the value of what we have learned. It simply reminds us that we are part of something larger, something that does not need to be fully contained within our awareness to be meaningful. And there is something quietly peaceful in that realization, because it shifts the goal of exploration away from reaching a final answer and toward continuing the journey, to observe more carefully, to ask better questions, to expand the boundary of understanding, even if that boundary never reaches the edge. It allows us to approach the unknown not as a problem to be solved, but as a space to be explored. And in doing so, it brings a certain kind of calm, because the pressure to understand everything begins to fade, replaced by something gentler, a curiosity that does not need to resolve itself, a willingness to sit with uncertainty without needing to remove it. And as this perspective begins to settle, something else quietly follows, because if there are limits to what we can understand, then the universe may contain layers of reality that are not just unseen, but fundamentally beyond our ability to fully interpret. And if that is the case, then the possibility of something existing beyond our awareness, something intelligent perhaps, no longer feels extraordinary. It feels consistent, like a natural extension of the pattern we've been tracing all along. As that quiet possibility settles in, that there may be layers of reality beyond what we can fully understand, another question begins to return, not as loudly as before, but more carefully now, more thoughtfully. If intelligence can exist beyond our awareness, then where is it? Or perhaps more gently, why does the universe seem so quiet? When you look up at the night sky, it feels still, peaceful, a vast expanse of darkness scattered with distant points of light. And for a long time that silence has carried a certain meaning. It has suggested emptiness, that perhaps, despite the immense scale of the universe, we might be alone. But as our understanding has grown, that interpretation has begun to shift. Because the universe is not small. Even without using numbers, it is difficult to fully grasp just how vast it is. Each star you see is part of a much larger structure, a galaxy. And beyond the stars visible to your eyes, there are countless more, stretching far beyond what can be directly observed. Around many of those stars, there are planets, worlds of different sizes, different temperatures, different conditions, some too hot, some too cold, but some potentially similar enough to Earth that life could arise. And when you consider how many of these worlds exist, the idea that life might appear in more than one place begins to feel natural, not certain, but reasonable. And yet, despite this quiet expectation, we have not found clear evidence of intelligent life beyond our own planet. No confirmed signals, no unmistakable signs of distant civilizations, just silence. This has led to a simple but profound question. If the universe is so vast, and if life is possible in many places, then why does everything seem so quiet? At first, this might feel like a contradiction, but there are many gentle possibilities that could explain it. One is distance. Even if intelligent life exists, it may be so far away that communication becomes difficult. Signals weaken over distance. Time stretches across vast scales. A message sent from one point in the universe may take longer to arrive than a civilization itself exists. Another possibility is timing. Civilizations may rise and fall. They may exist for a period of time and then fade, and if their existence does not overlap with ours, then even a universe full of life could still appear silent from our perspective. But there is another possibility that feels quieter and perhaps more subtle, that intelligence may exist, but not in a form we recognize, because recognition depends on familiarity, on knowing what to look for. If something communicates in a way that does not match our expectations, we may not interpret it as communication at all. It may pass through our instruments, through our observations, without being understood, like a message written in a language we do not yet know exists. There is also the possibility that intelligence, once it reaches a certain level, changes its behavior, that it becomes less visible, not more, less likely to send signals outward, less likely to announce its presence, not out of fear, but because it no longer needs to. You might think of how humans observe other forms of life on Earth. We study animals, we watch their behavior, but we do not always interact with them directly. We do not attempt to explain our world to them in ways they cannot understand. We simply observe quietly. And it becomes possible to imagine that a more advanced intelligence might take a similar approach, not interfering, not revealing itself, but existing, and perhaps observing. This idea is sometimes described in a simple way, that we may be part of a larger environment, one in which we are not the central focus, not alone, but not the primary participants either. This does not make us unimportant. It simply places us within a broader context, a universe that may contain many forms of life, each at different stages of understanding. And from this perspective, the silence of the universe begins to feel different, not empty, but quiet. A quiet that may not indicate absence, but distance, difference, or even restraint. And as we sit with that idea, gently, without urgency, another thought begins to form. Because if intelligence can exist in ways we do not recognize, then the absence of evidence may not be the same as evidence of absence. It may simply reflect the limits of how we observe, the limits of what we expect to find. And so, the question shifts once again. Not, why is there nothing out there? But, what if there is more than we're able to notice? And as that possibility settles, quietly reshaping the way we think about the universe, it leads naturally into a deeper reflection. Because throughout history, whenever we have encountered something we could not explain, we have found ways to fill that space, to give shape to the unknown, to turn uncertainty into something that feels familiar. And in doing so, we may have been revealing something not just about the universe, but about ourselves. As that quiet question shifts from where are they to something softer, what if we simply do not recognize them? Another pattern begins to emerge, not out there in the universe, but within us, in the way we respond to the unknown itself. Because throughout history, whenever humans have encountered something they could not explain, something unfamiliar, unpredictable, or just beyond understanding, we've tended to fill that space, not with silence, but with meaning. If you look back far enough, this pattern appears again and again. When lightning split the sky, it was not just a natural event, it became a sign, a message, the expression of something with intention. When the ocean moved in powerful, unpredictable ways, it was not simply water responding to forces, it became something alive, something with moods and purpose. These interpretations were not careless, they were deeply human. They gave shape to uncertainty. They allowed the mind to settle into a world that felt understandable, even when the deeper mechanisms were still hidden. And as knowledge slowly expanded, those earlier explanations were replaced, not because the need to understand disappeared, but because new patterns became visible, new ways of describing the world took their place. But something interesting happened along the way. The pattern itself did not disappear. Only the form of the explanation changed. Where once the unknown was filled with gods, now it is sometimes filled with something else. Aliens. When something unusual appears, something that does not fit within our current understanding, it can be tempting to imagine that it comes from beyond us, from a distant intelligence, from something watching, something hidden, something just out of reach. And while the possibility of life beyond Earth is a real and meaningful question, there is also a quieter layer to this response, a psychological one. Because the idea of aliens can sometimes serve a role similar to the earlier stories. It becomes a way of explaining what we do not yet understand, a way of placing something into the gap so that the gap does not feel empty. This does not mean that aliens do not exist. It simply means that the idea of them can be shaped by our need to explain. You might notice this in how quickly certain unexplained events are linked to external intelligence, a pattern that feels unusual, a signal that seems unfamiliar, a phenomenon that does not yet have a clear explanation. Rather than remaining open, rather than allowing the unknown to stay unknown, the mind gently moves toward a familiar kind of answer. There must be something behind this, and that something often takes a form that reflects our current understanding of intelligence. But this raises an important question. If our idea of aliens is shaped by the way we think, then how much of that idea reflects reality? And how much reflects us? Because every explanation we create is influenced by the tools we use to think, the patterns we recognize, the experiences we have had. And so, when we imagine intelligence beyond ourselves, we often imagine it in ways that are not entirely unfamiliar, more advanced perhaps, more capable, but still understandable within the framework we already know. And yet, as we have already begun to see, intelligence, even with small differences, can lead to entirely different ways of perceiving and organizing reality, which means that true differences, deeper differences, may not resemble our expectations at all. They may not fit into the categories we use. They may not behave in ways that we recognize as intentional or meaningful. And so, the idea of aliens becomes something more subtle, not just a question of whether they exist, but a reflection of how we approach the unknown. Do we allow space for uncertainty, or do we gently fill that space with something that feels familiar? This is not a flaw. It is part of how the human mind works. We are pattern-seeking, meaning-making. We look for connections, for explanations, for coherence. And when those are not immediately available, we create them, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. But always with the same quiet intention, to make sense of the world. And as we become aware of this pattern, something begins to shift. We do not need to abandon the idea of life beyond Earth, but we can hold it more carefully, more gently, without rushing to define it, without forcing it into shapes that feel comfortable. Because the unknown does not always need to be filled. Sometimes it is enough to simply observe it, to let it remain open, and in doing so, we create space for something more accurate to emerge over time. And as this awareness settles in, another possibility begins to take shape. Because if intelligence beyond us exists, and if it is not shaped by our expectations, then it may not resemble anything we have imagined, not in form, not in behavior, not even in the way it exists. And this leads us gently into the next step of the journey, where the question is no longer how we imagine intelligence, but whether intelligence itself might take forms that feel entirely unfamiliar. As that awareness settles in, that our ideas about the unknown are often shaped by our own patterns of thinking, something begins to open, a wider space, a space where we can begin to imagine, not what feels familiar, but what might actually be possible. Because once we loosen the assumption that intelligence must look like us, think like us, or exist in ways we recognize, the possibilities begin to change, very gently, but very profoundly. When people imagine life beyond Earth, it is natural to picture something physical, a body, a form, something that moves, senses, reacts, perhaps different in shape, perhaps more advanced, but still, in some way, similar to life as we know it. And this makes sense, because all of our experience with life comes from one place, one planet, one set of conditions. Everything we understand about biology, cells, growth, energy, reproduction, comes from observing life here. So when we imagine life elsewhere, we tend to extend what we already know. But the universe is not limited to the conditions of Earth. It contains environments far colder, far hotter, far more extreme than anything we experience in our daily lives. And if life can arise under different conditions, then it may take forms that do not resemble anything we are familiar with, forms that do not rely on the same structures, forms that do not need what we need. It is even possible that what we call life may not be the only way for intelligence to exist, because intelligence at its core is not about shape or material. It is about the ability to process information, to recognize patterns, to respond, adapt, and perhaps even reflect. And there are many ways that such processes could, in principle, occur, not only within biological systems, but potentially within systems that are entirely different from what we have known so far. You might imagine for a moment a kind of intelligence that is not built from cells, but from patterns of energy, or from structures that exist across scales too large or too small for us to easily perceive. Something that does not live in the way we define living, but still processes information, still responds to its environment, still exists as a coherent system. From our perspective, such a form of intelligence might not appear as a being at all. It might not move. It might not communicate in ways we recognize. It might not even appear separate from its surroundings. It could be part of a larger system, woven into the structure of its environment. And if that is the case, then recognizing it would not simply be difficult, it might be nearly impossible. Not because it is hidden, but because it does not match the patterns we are trained to notice. There is another possibility that follows just as quietly, that intelligence beyond a certain level may not need to remain in a physical form at all. If a system becomes advanced enough to understand and manipulate its environment, it may find ways to sustain itself in forms that are more stable, more efficient, or more expansive than a biological body. It may become less localized, less tied to a single place, less dependent on the conditions that gave rise to it. And from our perspective, such an intelligence might not appear as something separate from the environment. It might be diffuse, distributed, present in ways that do not align with our expectations of what a being is. You might think of how information moves through a network, not as a single object, but as patterns flowing across connections, difficult to point to directly, yet clearly present in its effects. In a similar way, intelligence could exist not as a single entity, but as a pattern spread across a system. And if we were to encounter such a pattern, we might not recognize it as intelligence at all. We might see only complexity, or randomness, or something that does not quite fit into our categories. And this brings us back to a quieter version of the question we've been following. Not just, are we alone, but what kinds of existence are we able to notice? Because the answer may not depend only on what is out there, but on what we are capable of recognizing. if intelligence can take forms beyond biology, beyond visibility, beyond familiar patterns, then the universe may be far more populated than it appears, not with creatures as we imagine them, but with systems, processes or structures that operate in ways we've not yet learned to interpret. This does not make the universe more crowded in a noisy or overwhelming way. If anything, it makes it quieter, more subtle, because these forms of existence would not need to announce themselves. They would simply be. And as this idea settles in, not as something to grasp tightly, but as something to gently consider, it opens the door to an even deeper possibility. Because if intelligence can evolve beyond familiar forms, then it may eventually reach a point where it can shape reality itself, not just observe it, not just exist within it, but influence its structure in ways we are only beginning to imagine. And from that perspective, the question shifts once more, from what intelligence looks like to what it might be capable of creating. As that possibility settles in, that intelligence, if it exists beyond us, may not resemble anything we expect. Another thought begins to form, not suddenly, but gradually, almost like a distant shape becoming clearer through a soft layer of mist. Because if intelligence can grow, adapt, and move beyond the limits of biology, then what might it eventually be capable of? Not just in terms of understanding reality, but in shaping it. To explore this idea, it helps to begin with something familiar, not from the distant future, but from everyday experience. Think about how digital worlds have evolved over time. There was a time when simple games consisted of moving shapes on a screen, a few colours, a few basic rules, simple interactions that hinted at something more, but remained clearly separate from reality. And yet, even in those early forms, something important was already present. A system, a set of rules that defined how things behaved, a small, contained world where patterns could unfold. Over time, those worlds became more detailed, more responsive, more immersive, from simple shapes to environments that resemble landscapes, cities, even entire ecosystems, characters that move, react, and interact in ways that feel increasingly natural. And while these systems are still limited, they reveal a direction, a gradual increase in complexity, a steady movement towards something that feels more and more like a complete environment. Now gently extend that progression forward, not just a few decades, but far beyond. Imagine a system that continues to grow in detail, in depth, in the richness of its interactions. A system where the distinction between what is simulated and what is experienced becomes less clear, where the internal consistency of the world is so complete that it feels real to anything existing within it. At that point, something interesting begins to happen. The question of whether the system is real from the outside becomes less important than how it is experienced from the inside. Because for anything within that system, the rules it follows, the patterns it observes, the environment it navigates, would form its reality, not a copy of reality, but its reality. And this leads to a quiet and somewhat surprising idea. If it is possible, even in principle, to create systems of increasing complexity, then it becomes possible to imagine a point where entire environments, the entire universes could be generated, not in a perfect sense, but in a way that is consistent, structured, and experienced as real by those within it. And if such systems can exist, then another question naturally follows. If they can be created, could we be inside one? This idea is sometimes referred to as a simulated reality, not as a definitive claim, but as a possibility worth considering, a way of asking whether the reality we experience is the most fundamental layer, or whether it might be part of something larger, something constructed. At first, this might feel like a dramatic shift, but if you approach it gently, it begins to feel like a natural extension of what we have already explored. We have seen that perception is a kind of interpretation, that reality, as we experience it, is filtered through the mind, that intelligence can exist at different levels, and that advanced intelligence may be capable of shaping its environment in ways we do not yet fully understand. So rather than being an abrupt idea, the possibility of a simulated reality becomes a quiet continuation of that pattern, a step further along the same path. And it does not need to be taken as something literal or immediate. It can simply be held as a question, a way of expanding how we think about what reality might be. Because whether or not we are inside such a system, the idea itself highlights something important. That reality, as we experience it, may not be the final layer. It may be one level among many, a structured environment with its own rules, embedded within something larger. And just as a character within a constructed world experiences its environment as complete and self-contained, we too experience our world as consistent and whole. We observe patterns. We discover laws that describe how things behave. We build understanding based on those patterns, and within that framework, everything makes sense. But the possibility remains, quietly in the background, that what we call reality is part of a deeper structure, not something that breaks the laws we observe, but something that gives rise to them. And as this idea begins to settle, gently, without urgency, it opens the door to an even more subtle reflection. Because if reality can be layered, if one level can exist within another, then the question is no longer simply whether we are inside a system, but how many layers there might be, and how far those layers extend. As that possibility settles in, that reality might not be the deepest layer, but one level within something larger. The mind begins to wander a little further, not in a rushed way, but gently, as though following a thread that continues just beyond what can be clearly seen. Because once the idea of a constructed reality becomes possible, even in principle, another question begins to form. If one layer can exist within another, then how many layers might there be? It is natural at first to imagine only two, a base level and a simulated one, something fundamental and something built upon it. But when you look more closely, that distinction begins to soften, because if a system can create a world within it, then that world, in turn, could contain systems of its own, and those systems could generate further layers, each one consistent within itself, each one experienced as real from the inside, like reflections in a mirror facing another mirror, stretching inward, one image within another, fading into distance, not abruptly ending, but continuing in a way that becomes harder to distinguish the deeper you go. This idea is sometimes described as a kind of nested structure, reality within reality, a sequence of layers, each emerging from the one before it, and from the perspective of any single layer, it would feel complete, self-contained, because everything within it would follow consistent patterns, stable rules, a reliable structure that allows for understanding, movement, and experience. In that sense, what we call real is not defined by being the deepest level, but by being internally consistent, by allowing experience to unfold in a coherent way. You might think of it like reading a story. When you're fully immersed, the world of the story feels real in its own context. The characters act according to their nature. The events follow a pattern. Within that narrative, everything makes sense, and yet the story exists within another layer, the one in which you are reading. Now imagine that the story itself contains another story, and within that, another. each layer meaningful from the inside, even if it is not the final level. And this is where the idea becomes quietly intriguing, because if such layering is possible, then the question of which level is the original becomes less clear. Not impossible to ask, but perhaps less important to experience. Because from within any given layer, what matters is not how deep it is, but how it behaves, how it feels, how it allows awareness to arise and interact with its surroundings. There is another gentle implication here as well. If layers can exist within layers, then the likelihood of being in the deepest layer may not be as high as we instinctively assume, not because there is a reason to prefer one layer over another, but because there may be many more layers that are constructed than ones that are not. It's like standing in a vast building with many rooms, some original, some added later. If most of the rooms are constructed extensions, then simply by chance you're more likely to be in one of those extensions than in the original foundation. This is not a conclusion. It is simply a way of looking at the structure of possibilities, a quiet shift in perspective, and as this idea drifts into place, it brings with it a certain kind of stillness, because it does not require a final answer. It does not demand that we determine which layer we are in. Instead, it invites us to notice something more subtle, that the experience of reality, the sense of being here, aware, present, remains meaningful regardless of the layer, whether this world is the deepest level or one among many. The patterns you observe, the thoughts you have, the experiences you feel are still real within this context. They still unfold according to consistent rules. They still form a coherent picture of existence. And so, the idea of layered reality does not remove meaning. If anything, it adds a certain depth to it, a sense that what we experience is part of something larger, even if that larger structure is not fully visible. And as this thought continues to drift, gently expanding outward, another question begins to rise alongside it. Because if reality can exist in layers, and if those layers are experienced from within, then what about the sense of time within those layers? The feeling of moving forward, moment by moment, from past to present to future. Is that movement something fundamental, or is it also part of the structure we experience from the inside? And as that question begins to take shape, softly, without urgency, it draws our attention towards something even more familiar. Not the structure of the universe, but the experience of being within it. As that sense of layered reality continues to drift quietly in the background, the idea that what we experience may be one level among many, something even more familiar begins to come into focus. Not the structure of the universe, but the feeling of moving through it, moment by moment. Because no matter how reality is structured, whether simple or layered, fundamental or constructed, your experience unfolds in a very particular way. You are always here, always in what we call the present moment, not in the past, not in the future, but in a narrow slice of time that seems to move forward continuously. If you pause and notice it, this movement feels natural, almost invisible, like the steady flow of a river. Moments pass, one becomes the next, and your awareness travels along with them. But what is this movement really? Is time itself flowing? Or is it something else? Something more subtle? To explore this, imagine a long path stretching out before you. Every step along that path represents a moment. From where you stand, you can see only a small portion clearly, the step you are currently on. Behind you, there are steps you have already taken. Ahead of you, steps that you have not yet reached. And as you move, your position along the path changes, but the path itself, may already be there, complete, not unfolding as you move, but existing as a whole. In this view, the sense of time passing is not the path being created, but your awareness moving across it, experiencing one moment at a time. This idea can feel a little unfamiliar at first, because it shifts the focus from time as something that flows, to time as something that is already structured, and your experience as something that moves within that structure. It's like reading a book. This story is already written from beginning to end, every page exists. But as you read, you encounter the story one line at a time. From your perspective, the future is unknown. But from another perspective, the entire narrative is already there. This does not remove the meaning of the story. It does not make the experience less real. It simply changes how we think about its structure. And this leads to another gentle question. If your experience of time is like moving through a story, then what about the choices you make within it? The feeling that you could have acted differently, that at each moment there are possibilities branching out in different directions. This sense of choice is deeply familiar. It feels immediate, personal, undeniable. You decide what to say, what to do, where to go, and yet, if each moment is part of a larger structure, then those choices may also be part of that structure, not forced, but unfolding according to patterns that are already in place. This does not mean that choice is an illusion in a simple sense. You still experience decision-making, you still weigh options, consider outcomes, and act. But the deeper question becomes whether those processes are entirely open, or whether they follow pathways shaped by the structure of reality itself. You might think of it like standing at a crossroads. From where you stand, there are multiple paths you could take, each one leading somewhere different. But from a wider perspective, the paths themselves are already laid out. Your movement is real, your experience of choosing is real, but the possibilities are defined by the structure within which you exist. And this brings us gently back to the role of consciousness. Because consciousness is what allows you to experience this movement through time, to be aware of the present, to remember the past, to imagine the future. It is the lens through which reality is experienced. But even here, there is something quietly mysterious. Because while we can describe many aspects of how the brain works, how signals move, how patterns form, how activity changes over time, the experience of awareness itself remains difficult to fully explain, not in terms of function, but in terms of feeling. Why does experience feel like something from the inside? Why is there a sense of presence at all? And if consciousness is tied to the way we move through time, then it becomes possible to wonder whether our experience of reality is shaped not only by what exists, but by how we are able to experience it. That the flow of time, the sense of choice, the feeling of being here are all part of the interface through which reality becomes meaningful. And as this idea settles, softly, without urgency, it connects back to everything we have explored so far. Perception as a filter, understanding as a limited framework, reality as potentially layered, intelligence as something that may exist beyond our current comprehension. All of these threads begin to weave together, not into a single answer, but into a quiet realization that what we experience is shaped as much by how we are built as by what exists. And as we rest within that realization, gently, without needing to resolve it, we arrive at a place that feels both uncertain and peaceful at the same time. Because even without final answers, the experience itself remains, the sense of being here, of observing, of wondering, and perhaps that, in its own quiet way, is enough. As all of these ideas begin to settle, not as separate pieces but as something gently connected, a final, perspective starts to form, not a conclusion in the usual sense, not an answer that resolves everything, but something quieter, a way of holding everything we have explored without needing to close it. Because along this journey we have followed a thread, from the limits of perception, to the way humans have explained the unknown, to the vastness of the universe, to the possibility that intelligence may exist beyond our understanding, and even to the idea that reality itself might be layered, structured in ways we're only beginning to imagine. And at each step something similar has appeared. Not certainty, but openness, a widening space where questions live alongside understanding. And this is where science, in its quiet and steady way, becomes most meaningful. Because science does not promise to remove mystery. It does not claim to reveal everything. Instead, it offers something more grounded, a way of moving through uncertainty, a way of exploring reality without needing to fill every gap immediately. You might think of it like walking through a landscape with a gentle, steady light. The light does not illuminate everything at once. It shows you where you are. It helps you take the next step. And as you move forward, the light moves with you, revealing new details, while always leaving something beyond its reach. In this way, science is not a collection of final answers. It is a process, a method of asking questions carefully, of testing ideas, of refining understanding over time, and perhaps most importantly, of being willing to change when new evidence appears. This willingness is what allows knowledge to grow, not rigidly but gently, not by holding tightly to what we believe, but by remaining open to what we might learn. There is a certain kind of strength in that openness, a quiet confidence that does not depend on knowing everything, but on knowing how to continue, and this becomes especially important when we consider the larger questions we have explored. The possibility of intelligence beyond our awareness, the idea that reality may extend beyond what we can fully perceive or understand, the thought that some aspects of existence may remain just beyond reach. These are not questions that demand immediate answers. They are questions that invite patience, that encourage us to observe more carefully, to think more deeply, to remain curious, even in the absence of certainty. And in that sense, science becomes more than a tool for discovery. It becomes a way of relating to the unknown, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity, not with urgency, but with steady attention. There is also something else that science provides, something that is easy to overlook. It helps us navigate the world we already understand. It allows us to build, to communicate, to create systems that support life and growth. Without it, much of what we rely on would not exist. The technologies we use, the understanding of health, the ability to explore beyond our immediate surroundings, all of these are shaped by the same process of careful observation and refinement. And so, while science does not give us complete knowledge of the universe, it gives us something just as important: direction. A way forward, a way of continuing the journey, even when the destination is not fully visible. And as we come to rest with that idea, something begins to feel lighter, because the need for final answers softens, replaced by an appreciation for the process itself, the act of wondering, the act of exploring, the act of slowly expanding the boundary of what we understand. You might notice, in this moment, that the questions we began with have not disappeared. Are we alone? Is there intelligence beyond us? Are we inside something larger than we can perceive? These questions remain, but they feel different now, less urgent, less demanding, more like quiet companions, walking alongside us as we continue to explore, and perhaps that is enough. Not to know everything, but to keep asking, to keep observing, to keep moving gently forward. Because in a universe that may be far larger, deeper, and more complex than we can fully grasp, the ability to wonder is already something extraordinary. And so, we arrive here, not at the end of the journey, but at a quiet pause, a place where everything we have explored can simply exist together, without needing to be resolved, without needing to be complete, just as part of a larger unfolding that continues whether we fully understand it or not. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open or you're already floating somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being part of this little journey. If you'd like to join me again for more gentle wanderings, you're always welcome to subscribe or share this with someone who could use a peaceful pause. Time has a way of slipping through our fingers, but here in this quiet moment, it's just you and the soft hush of rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.